Dear participants in the conference, I'm glad to be chairing this panel on the challenges of Europeanization in the Western Balkans. My name is Florian Bieber, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference. It's a great pleasure to have this panel. Of course, unfortunately, not live in person, but live in different destinations and locations. We have 3 panelists at the moment. We are scheduled to have 5. We expect that the missing panelists will join us shortly and have their presentations afterwards. So I'm just, without wasting any more time, I'm going to give the floor to Nikoleta Đukanović, who is a lecturer at the University of Donja Gorica in Montenegro. She'll be talking about Europeanization of Montenegro during the crisis of EU enlargement policy. So Nikoleta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. So, dear colleagues, dear professors, thank you very much for this really great opportunity to be part of this conference. My topic of the presentation includes the issue of the Europeanization of Montenegro's foreign policy, both in terms of foreign policy goals within the EU enlargement policy and in terms of the overall changes in our political culture. The presentation includes an analysis of the political dimension of the EU conditionality policy, the relationship between Montenegro and the Union through a regional comparative perspective, with a special emphasis on the analysis of Montenegro's achievements up to this moment in the process of EU integrations. On the other hand, considering the capacities of the Union itself when it comes to its enlargement policy, numerous crises have been triggered the European Union in the recent years. In this regard, the presentation is going to discuss the implications of the current crisis on the process of Europeanization of Montenegro's foreign policy, considering the issue of whether and what extent such crises pose a risk to Montenegro's integration to the EU. In Montenegro, although traditionally the negotiations are one of the most current daily political topic, meeting the necessary conditions and criteria for membership, this giving the impression of a true orientation and a political will to implement all required reforms. But in practice, this is absolutely not the case, as shown by this year's European Commission Progress Report, as well as the previous one from 2019. On one hand, we have the fact that for many years, Montenegro has been seen as a regional leader in terms of the results achieved in this process, and it has been abused by the authorities in Montenegro. It is not unimportant to point out that this was forced, even often point out by the leaders of the institutions, which I consider to be a big mistake and something that was significantly abused in Montenegro by the authorities. Namely, despite the political crisis that lasted from 2016 until this year's parliamentary elections in August 2020, many reports marked Montenegro as a positive example in the region in terms of success of the negotiation process. Unfortunately, such conclusions were drawn predominantly based on the number of the open chapters rather than the substance of the reforms. Thus, the years were wasted in convincing citizens that the best results are being achieved when the factual situation is exemplified in this year's progress report. So Montenegro has opened all 33 chapters so far. The last chapter 8, competition, we opened at the end of June this year. Nevertheless, the number of open and temporarily closed chapters is not an indicator of success in the process of implementing reforms. Before I look at the results of Montenegro's European integration process, several facts should be highlighted. Firstly, the transformative influence of the EU on Montenegro, i.e. its role in the process of democratization and democratic consolidation, is immense, even crucial. We know that the Union has often been presented as a democratizing factor in the region, and I believe that Montenegro is a real example. As much as they criticize the Union, it is the first and foremost a civilization project fully needed by the region within this process of the Europeanization and democratization. However, it is important to emphasize also the Union's position in this process. The dominant approaches in Europeanization theory point to the cruciality of the asymmetric power possessed by the European Union, which combined with the open membership perspective and the cost of withdrawal from the process. This forms the core of the European Union power. So the conditionality of the European Union generates a reaction, polarization, and a sense of injustice in most countries of the Western Balkans, especially when it touches upon nationally sensitive and unresolved post-conflict issues. On the other hand, although the open policy of conditioning in Montenegro has often caused a sense of injustice, polarization, a decline in enthusiasm in the governing structures, the EU truly represents the only hope for us to be an orderly society. So far, all reforms, all effective laws, improvement of the implementation of these laws have been the product of the policy and requirements of the EU, and not our true inner desire to improve our society. That is why it is important to take advantage of the new opportunities that the Union gives us. The new methodology in the accession process, which formally changes this year only after 17 years, the last time it was done in 2003, was nevertheless an encouraging indicator of the waking of the EU enlargement policy, with all those events from October 2019 that were directly tied to the Western Balkans, despite the fact that the EU had a bigger concern, Brexit. The negotiation conducted by Montenegro since 2012 and the ineffectiveness of mechanism for monitoring progress and an objective review of the results in the process were indicators of the necessity to introduce a new methodology. When it comes to the evaluating the overall policy in the areas covered by the chapters and assessing the overall process of Montenegro in accession negotiations, the EU Commission in last report, but also in 2019 report, did not give too much praise for reforms in variety areas. Such findings significantly differentiate these last two reports from previous ones. A new report from the European Commission shows that Montenegro has continued to have mediocre results in the European integration process. Neither this nor last year we received any of the highest marks in terms of significant progress, not even the lowest one, regression. The average score for Montenegro is 3.18, although it is slightly better than last year. Today we stand where we were actually 4 years ago, when we had exactly these assessments of the European Commission in 2016. 7 chapters received a very good grade, but 25 remained at the intermediate level. In brief, we have been negotiating for more than 8 years, but we still experience the same problems. Not only the report contains a very detailed analysis of the situation along with current issue, but also clear recommendations that new governments should adhere to very strictly if we strive to have better results in the next progress report. This is especially important nowadays when the negotiations are underway in Montenegro on the formation of the new government. The 3 very different blocks that make up the government today consist of 12 very diverse, often conflicting political entities, which make this process even more complicated. Although the elections brought Montenegro an end to a political union, the first time the government has been replaced, resulting in the changes within the political discourse also. Let's go back to the report. We are particularly criticized for the lack of substantial results in key areas of the rule of law, the fight against organized crime and corruption, the effective work of institutions in the fight of corruption, judicial reform, and similar areas. According to the European Commission's evaluation form from the last progress report, Montenegro's commitment to making progress in implementing measurable and structural reforms is lower than in some countries in the region. I will remind you that this was also the case last year with last progress reports as compared to Albania and North Macedonia. The key points of the integration of Montenegro are the impossibility of establishing a positive and constructive political dialogue, the need to find a broad inter-party and social consensus in the Montenegrin parliament, divulgation of several political scandals, then the low trust of citizens in the electoral system and the electoral process, politicization and non-transparency of institutions, insufficient and selective application of legal rules in the fighting against the corruption and organized crime, weaknesses in the system of disciplinary responsibility of the judges and prosecutors and judicial reform, then issues in establishment of self-regulatory mechanisms and overcoming the polarization of the media scene, and many, many others. Bearing in mind that these are imperatives for chapters 23 and 24 and further progress in the process of Montenegro's accession to the Union, the question arises as to whether this is a serious period of stagnation in the process. It should be kept in mind that European Commission document on the situation in chapters 23 and 24 also shows that Montenegro is stagnant in these areas, and in some parts regression has also been recorded. I must point out to the fact that at last year's progress report, the change the rhetoric when it comes to assessing the real situation in our country was very important for the future accession of the European Union, from which only Montenegrin society benefits. And it primarily refers to preventing the display of apparent reforms and questionable results in order to bring about the sustainable social change. It seems that the NATO membership, a successful regional cooperation, the harmonization of the national legislation with the EU laws are not sufficient indicators of the country's success in the terms of Europeanization of foreign policy, but should be an incentive for a clear, concrete and sustainable results in further negotiations and specific internal democratic reform. We can conclude that Montenegrin foreign policy is undergoing a successful process of Europeanization in the institutional level. But when it comes to the foreign policy goals and the norms within the enlargement policy and the development cooperation, situation is really uncertain and questionable. On the other hand, when we talk about the Union itself, it has been facing numerous internal difficulties and external challenges for years, not to mention all of them because of the time. However, the most current ones should be highlighted, such as consequences of the Brexit, financial crisis, populism and the fear of the growing right, then the crisis of liberalism in Europe, the renewal of sovereignty, anti-liberalism and the emergence of populism. Today, we have a kind of renewal of anti-liberal discourse, which is why the question is whether and how to come from those ideals and promise of the united Europe. When we analyze the roots of this crisis, the problem of the relationship between the EU and the nation is especially significant. Due to all of aforementioned obstacles when it comes to the development of the Union, many theories have talked about structural differentiation of the Union along the most important lines. Nowadays, we witness that the debate on the future of the EU is very popular, taking in mind all these enumerated crises. On the other hand, the countries of the Western Balkans are outside of the Union, and the question is whether and when we will restore optimism to EU enlargement policy to Western Balkan countries, especially in the Brexit era, when we saw the French veto as a crisis of the enlargement policy and the victim of Brexit. Of course, the new methodology is an attempt to restore credibility to the enlargement policy and to return the enlargement to the list of priorities. Of course, Brexit and other crises in the Union have a major impact on our enlargement policy. I strongly believe that the future development of the Union as well as the enlargement policy depends on the redistribution of the power within the Union following the exit of the United Kingdom. Even Macron's action to oppose the views of almost all member states was predominantly aimed at trying to straighten its position in Europe after the UK voted to leave the EU, especially in relation to Berlin. So the EU reforms are necessary, and the question is whether the EU will be able to become more sovereign, democratic, and closer to its citizens, as Macron previously announced, despite all the above crises, challenges, and open issues. I will stop here. So maybe another question we can discuss later together with other questions. Thank you, Bieber.
Thank you, Nikoleta. Thank you very much for this presentation overview, as well as also sticking to the time so rigorously. I very appreciate it, because we've been joined by the two missing presenters, Adam Fagan and Petar Kurecic. So I would then resume now with the paper order in the way it was originally announced. And as a result, I will give the floor to Adam Fagan, who's a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy of King's College London, and he will be talking about reforming judicial training in Serbia under EU guidance, too much independence and insularity, but not enough impartiality. So, Adam, I would give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Florian. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you. Now we can see you. Perfect. Great.
Oh, you can see me. Okay.
We can see you now. Thanks.
You may not want to see me at the moment. But so firstly, apologies for being late. I forgot that Britain is behind the rest of Europe and the rest of the world in every sense, but including time. So I got my hands a bit confused. But you know, let me just slap on a couple of other caveats. This is very much research in progress. It's research carried out with Vanja Savic of King's College London and Indranil Sarkar of the LSE, and it is work that we're conducting research at the moment. It has been stalled slightly because of little bits of local difficulties, but it follows. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just explain really what we're doing and to offer you some preliminary. We have got some results, some data, but it is quite limited at the moment. Okay, so our question, or our puzzle, the thing that guides our research is this question: why, despite significant EU assistance and institutional change, do concerns about judicial independence in the Western Balkans remain unabated? Why does this linger? Why is there this continual discussion? Now, it's very interesting because we're also doing some work on Slovakia, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and we're asking a very similar question, which of course is why, after decades of EU support and also EU membership, again, are these questions still being asked about judicial independence, when it's been very much at the fulcrum of the EU's intervention as part of the enlargement agenda. And it really does strike at the heart of Europeanization and the whole enlargement process, because the EU strategy for bolstering or improving judicial independence has focused on the introduction of new rules and primarily new rules, but also has placed great emphasis on training and professional recruitment. So in many ways, it offers a very interesting case study of everything to do with enlargement and Europeanization. In the case of Serbia, a candidate country, obviously since 2012, the approach the EU has taken has involved supporting the establishment of the High Judicial Council, a relatively autonomous body that was set up to improve the recruitment of judges by removing the power of judicial appointment from the executive, the Ministry of Justice, and developing the responsibility, or devolving the responsibility rather, to a new body composed of judges, judicial professional associations, and representatives from the legislature. Now, in other papers we've written about the contentiousness of this, the idea of just creating a new institution that was, replacing existing networks, existing processes. So I won't get into that discussion here. The EU justifies this because it is, or legitimizes this in terms of the creation of autonomous bodies, improving the insularity or creating these autonomous bodies follows a so-called European model. And they point to France, Italy, Spain as examples where this apparently works. The EU's approach can thus, in a nutshell, be described as combining the introduction of new rules that will hopefully lead to re-socialization. So we're really questioning, okay, given all of that, why is it still being held up as a problem area, both externally in terms of critiques, but also by the EU itself? And that leads us to a question really is, how effective are the Judicial Academy and the High Judicial Council? How effective are these new institutions? The reason, I suppose, for undertaking this research is to extend our understanding of why, despite extensive EU conditionality and assistance around judicial reform, this perception, as I say, of judicial independence is still an issue. In terms of our intellectual, the foundations of our research, or what the concepts we're using, we draw on Ishama and Ishama's distinction between two dimensions of judicial independence: impartiality or fairness and insularity. And this tension is well debated and discussed in the comparative literature. That and it is our assertion that the problem with the EU's approach is there's been far too much attention placed on the latter, i.e., insularity, in firewalling judges, with far too little emphasis placed on the former, i.e., the quality of decisions, the quality of judgments, and the whole notion of fairness. Indeed, we argue that despite the substantial improvements made to judicial independence through these new institutions created and the institutional reforms that all improve insularity and structural independence, there's been very little attention on what goes on the benches. Okay, the quality of decisions, the fairness of the outcomes. So that leads us to a problem, an intellectual problem, which is how do we disentangle and measure impartiality? To do this, we use vignettes. We use experimental methods. We use vignettes developed by Niemi et al. To conduct a survey experiment administered to trainees at the Serbian Judicial Academy to examine the extent to which respondents rely on reciprocity, loyalty, and clarity in their decision making. What we're the key variable is time and stage of career. So we're targeting new recruits, those who've been in their profession for 2 years, and those at various stages of their career, right up until, hopefully, and this is, it obviously gets more difficult to connect with those at the most senior levels. But in order to gauge the extent to which these new institutions or these new rules are actually having an impact. In terms of broader discussions regarding international socialization, the process of EU enlargement in particular, what our research highlights is the subjective nature of the EU strategies to reform the judicial practices beyond measures simply to bolster independence. So that's really our framework. That hopefully gives you some indication of what our methods. Let me jump very quickly now to what we've got so far and what our data seems to be suggesting. Well, if we use the World Economic Forum data, it is evident that the creation of these highly autonomous judicial councils everywhere does not deliver particular effect, and therefore, even in countries, if you take Croatia as a very good example, where arguably graduated from the Western Balkans into a member state, there's very little evidence there that those new shiny institutions and processes, that had any particular impact. If you look at the reporting and look at the data in terms of everything from the number of the speed at which cases are dealt with, perceptions of impartiality, public opinion, which of course is very important about the judiciary. So we argue, and our data would hopefully will confirm this, that it is necessary to move towards greater accountability, to place far greater emphasis on input from national parliaments. However, scrub that. I'm just reading off my PowerPoint here, which suddenly has darted all over the screen. What we recommend and what our data suggests is that the most important reforms that the EU can support is what the literature refers to as silent professionalisation, i.e. reforms of in the realm of public administration report that talks about measures that address attitudes and socialisation. And arguably, this has been this has received the least support and emphasis from the EU, and it is actually where, and the literature would certainly endorse this. This is where the greatest effect is likely to be seen. So lessons from elsewhere, but also in former post-communist states, shows that it is necessary for the EU and other international actors to provide a supporting role to design these institutions to be independent of control from the executive. That's absolutely right. The insularity is important, but not to conflate insularity with independence. In other words, building big walls round judges and judicial institutions does not convince populations that decisions that take place within those walls are immune from being subjective or from interference. And it's often said in the literature that those very, very high walls are no less penetrable. In other words, the response of the EU and other international organizations is to say, okay, in communist countries, the lack of any kind of separation between the judiciary and executive and legislature is the key problem, and therefore you separate judges with the aim or with the hope that they will then deliver fairer and more proper decisions. What that underestimates or undermines is that what you are doing is sealing judges from a whole set of processes, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes of their rulings will be any better or perceived to be any more fair. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm really happy to take questions, comments, or whatever. Our data is coming in. We had really sincerely hoped that by now we would have conducted lots of these experimental surveys. We've got a couple of researchers working in Serbia, but unfortunately it has been absolutely impossible for them to do more than a couple of these sessions online. So I had hoped to be able to show lots of data. I just don't have that data. So unfortunately, all I can really say, hopefully this presentation has given you some indication of what we're banging on about and what we're trying to achieve. And who knows, at some point, nice, interesting data will emerge the other side. So I'll just leave it there if that's all right.
Great, thanks a lot, Adam, and also sticking to the time and giving us some food for thought. The way we're going to be doing this is that we're going to have a conversation about the papers at the end, where I'll ask a few questions to kick it off and give a chance to have the presenters ask each other questions. So I would now continue with Petar Kurecic, who has joined us in the meantime. Petar Kurecic is the associate professor at the University of the North in Croatia, and he's going to be talking about the EU and the Western Balkans accession and basically a record of the Croatian presidency of the European Union. So, Petar, the floor is yours. I see you also have a PowerPoint presentation too.
Yeah, if it's okay.
Yeah, it works. It works. We can see the presentation. Okay. So, please, the floor.
It will be easier in this way, just to.
Great. If you could just activate the presentation mode so we can see the full.
Okay.
That would be great.
1 second. Okay. Because I already Is it okay now?
No, just on the presentation mode, either F5 if you have a...
Yeah.
Just perfect. Great.
It takes a little bit time.
Okay, yeah, perfect. We see it now. Peter, go ahead.
Probably because of the connection or something.
Yeah.
Okay, I will try to make it as brief as possible, because I have some things that are probably that you already know, of course. So as we already know, Croatia was presiding in the first half of this year, and it can be called as first wave COVID presidency. We all hope that it will be just called COVID presidency, but as we can see now, it was only the first wave, unfortunately. So most things in the couple of slides are just an introduction. As we already know, Western Balkans are lagging behind in the economic development, in the judiciary independency, in the corruption level, at least of the perception of the public sector regarding corruption in these states. And of course, after all these years, after the wars have finished, for the last 20 years, we have not seen a satisfactory economic development. Here is just a brief example how it looks for the Western Balkan states. GNI per capita, we have seen some improvements, but still these 6 states are lagging behind the EU, even behind the post-socialist member states. What is most disappointing is that the investment cycle and the rapid economic development that occurred in Visegrad 4 and in the Baltic states is not probable to happen in the Western Balkan states. It hasn't occurred in Croatia as well, because Croatia accessed during the time of the recession, and of course the investment climate was not so good as in the Central European new EU members. Western Balkan states, as well as Croatia, and of course some other post-socialist EU member states, are faced with something that is mostly then ignored by the EU, and that is the demographic exodus. We could also see it here. So these 6 states have lost quite a substantial proportion of their population, or are on the way to losing it. And of course, the approach to the EU and the relaxation of the restrictions regarding labor freedom and the freedom of movement of people will probably accelerate these trends, because we simply do not see economic development that would be substantial to hold the most productive part of the population. Of course, COVID crisis now has decelerated these trends, but it will not last forever. And of course, after it is finished, this will continue. So, what are probably the main challenges for the Western Balkans enlargement? Economic underdevelopment, corruption, the problem with the independence of the judicial branch of government, and this is what is interesting. Is the EU trying to integrate the Western Balkans because it really has to, and it thinks it's a great thing, or simply to avoid the other external players of course, entering the region and increasing their influence above the level that is now present. Regarding the particular topic, Croatian presidency, of course, it happened during the COVID crisis, the first wave and lockdown. So many things had to be put aside, but the expectations were not very high because, of course, Croatia is a small country. It's located on the European fringe. It is the most recent EU member. It is basically a periphery of the EU. Some goals were definitely fulfilled, such as opening of the negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. Also, Zagreb summit was held, and probably this historical perspective and relations that Croatia has with some countries of the region was actually not such a burden as probably it was expected to be, because simply these things were not put in front of the concrete tasks and everything that was happening during the presidency. I have here prepared and emphasized a couple of citations from the document that was published by GONG NGO, which prepared a document regarding the Croatian presidency. This is non-official document, so it is probably more objective in that sense. Here are some priorities that were emphasized. Of course, rule of law probably remains in the Balkans. Besides this economic problems, one of the biggest obstacles for more rapid and more successful integration into the EU, at least from the Western Balkan side. From the EU side, of course, since it's a dialectic relationship, bilateral, there has to be really a genuine will to integrate these countries. What is also interesting, I will not read, of course, every line. The most important things are here put in red, so you can see them. We all know about ethnic nationalism and authoritarian tendencies in certain countries. So this is it. Probably the chapter 23, as in Croatia's case, will be the hardest to finish and successfully for each Western Balkans country. What is interesting, what I also wanted to say, because we had election campaign, the elections, general elections, we had them at the beginning of July 2020. So the elections were put a little bit early, although they were regular, because they were in 2020 supposed to be held. And the government in this campaign tried to use the presidency to bolster about the successes. Of course, it was a bit uncritical, and of course the opposition, either from the left side and then from the right side, tried to simply say this was the worst presidency ever. You have achieved nothing. Has the presidency actually happened? We are waiting for Germany to take over. So both sides were really uncritical, but because of the election campaign, the presidency probably got more room in the Croatian public media, both the ones close to the government and the ones that are totally critical. So there were more debates about the presidency than it probably would occur if we didn't have the the election. What I can say for conclusion, we still have to wait a little bit to see the results, but it was not a normal presidency because of COVID, of course. It didn't fulfill, I think, the expectations of some circles, and of course, but we cannot say that it was a total disaster. I mean, this is something that is really uncritical and should not be used in a normal serious scientific discourse. I hope that we are on the path of some achievements, and that the Western Balkans enlargement process will go on. But I'm usually faced with critics when I speak at various conferences, when I say that most Western Balkans countries will not join before 2030. And it is always considered as too pessimistic, but the trends are simply showing that not many significant achievements have been made. The process is long. Probably it has already produced fatigue in some countries, and we also can see that moving towards the EU, at least declaratively, does not necessarily mean that the historical problems and authoritarian tendencies and all other negative trends will be surpassed. Yeah. So this will be it briefly, and of course I'm open for discussion later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Petar, as well for again the discipline of timing is excellent in this particular panel. I'm very delighted.
Yeah. I have to say it is very difficult to speak in online conferences.
Exactly.
Yes, sorry.
It's also hard to pay attention, so it's good to be short and concise. I think that helps a lot for all of us, and we'll have time for some discussions afterwards. So now I would go and jump ahead, because in the program Nikoleta would be next, but she's already presented. So we've got Athena Skolariki, who is at the University of Crete, an assistant professor, and she will be looking at EU integration, enlargement fatigue, and the Europeanization discourse in the case of North Macedonia. Athena, you are on, and hope to see you. Hope your camera's on.
Mike, I have to.
Yeah, if you mute yourself, Petar, that's good. And
her is not.
Athena, your microphone is not on. You would have to reactivate your microphone.
Yes, it's okay now.
It's good, but yes, now we hear you, we see you. Yes. Athena, the floor is yours.
Fine. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. So in my presentation, I will not discuss EU policy choices and strategies. I will rather focus on discourses and their consequences. I start from the assumption that social realities are constructed and reproduced through discursive practices. So in this sense, discourse is not separated from action. It has a very concrete impact, not only on representations, but on policies as well. I will argue, therefore, that the dominant framing of EU enlargement in the Balkans obstructs the very purpose of the Western Balkans integration in the European Union, while it fails to restrain illiberal tendencies. Let me start with the terms. The project of European integration has produced a new vocabulary, which is characterized by quite meaningful ambiguity. The use of the words Europe and European, instead of describing the continent as a whole, tend to refer solely to the European Union. In regards to the EU project, the concept of Europeanization has a double meaning. It is used to signify either the construction of a European political unity and or a common European culture and identity, either, and more often, the integration of a country or region to the EU. However, in this second case, the term implies that the country or region is not European, it has to become. In regards to the Balkans, more precisely, the use of this term, along with other references of EU officials to the alleged cultural specificity of the region and its people, is reinforcing a biased image of the Balkans, seen as located at the margins of Europe, characterized by essentialized differences in comparison to the European norm. This discourse, which is largely internalized and reproduced by the people in the region, is enhancing long-lasting stereotypes of inferiority and otherness vis-à-vis the Western Europe. From the perspective of the Balkan states, since the early 1990s, the EU is a priori as a model of economic development, of state building, and as a point of reference in regards to culture and identity. Despite the current economic and institutional crisis of the EU, and despite the negative example of member states, Bulgaria and Romania, which are stuck with serious structural deficiencies, European integration is still largely perceived in the Western Balkans as a safe haven, a guarantee of stability and growth, and as the only way forward for all the states in the region. Although these perceptions partly lay on objective facts, the belief that EU accession is the remedy against all Balkan curses stems from the above-mentioned interiorization by the Balkan societies of a position of inferiority and subordination vis-à-vis the so-called West. This attitude, based on deeply grounded stereotypes and schematizations, is not new. The author of Ruritania, Vesna Goldsworthy, speaking about growing up in Yugoslavia, explains how affected were people by the divide between East and West, which, even during the Cold War, was much more than a political division. I quote, "The Balkans were representing all the things we were longing to escape from, while Europe was offering what we wanted to be. For the people of the Balkan periphery, Europe has always been a distant ideal. After the collapse of the communist regimes and the conflicts in former Yugoslavia, the longing for Europe is even stronger and is now embraced by political elites. One of the most salient features of the way European integration is framed in the official documents, the media, and academic research, and in the projects of policymakers is the conceptualization of a country's accession as a process of political and cultural transformation. Through the mechanism of conditionality, the EU presents itself as a normative actor, promoting democratic principles, civic liberties, and the rule of law. The former EU Enlargement Commissioner Stefan Füle was explicit about the ambitious vision shared by many in the Union when he urged for finishing the transformation of the European continent. He identified the enlargement as the most important transformation instrument of the EU. However, one can question the positive picture given by Füle, bearing in mind the political and economic situation in member states like Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. As Dimitar Bechev pointed out, in the Balkans, Europeanization held out a promise of modernization and convergence with the rich and well-governed countries of old Europe. But the unfolding Greek drama deals a serious blow to this convergence narrative. Analyst Niku Popescu commented, "Today, the EU is brutally exposed to the limits of its transformative power. EU's pro-democracy talk is more muted than ever before in the last 2 decades. EU's professed attempts to defend democratic principles in the Eastern neighborhood are increasingly disappointing." Popescu's criticism is valid also for the Western Balkans, where, for the sake of constructiveness, EU officials are equally reluctant when it comes to disapprove practices that breach democratic principles and human rights. The logic of engagement, explains Popescu, is to cooperate and strengthen links with authoritarian regimes without criticizing them too openly, in the expectation that such cooperative links will build up internal constituencies for reform and will help the EU gain leverage over time. But it is also true that often engagement becomes an excuse for ignoring values for quite a number of EU member states. for many European states are more interested in selling BMWs than democracy. End of quote. The so-called transformative power of the EU is nowadays under question. It has been proven that the accession process to the EU is not providing a strong incentive for reforms and structural change in all the countries equally, while not all member states change significantly by EU integration. A lot depends on political circumstances and on domestic political culture, as well as on the attractiveness of EU norms in comparison to other deep-rooted practices. The political cost related to the compliance to EU requirements is also a factor that impedes this process. Additionally, the norms promoted by the EU are presented as a set of values which are perceived as commonly shared and taken for granted. Democratization, good governance, the rule of law, human rights, market economy, etc. are general concepts that operate as slogans in a politically correct vocabulary. It is, however, questionable whether there is a consensus about the relevant policies and in what extent they are implemented in each of the EU member states themselves. Research has demonstrated that the leverage of the EU and its ability to prompt reforms depend also on domestic factors. Political leaders and other actors who are certain to lose power by the process of democratization are less responsive to the EU pressures for structural reform. Additionally, the transformative power of the EU in Eastern and Southern Eastern Europe is challenged by the renewed influence of Russia and by the emergence of a counter-model of capitalist economic development that does not rely on democracy, but rather on strong authoritarian governments that support an economic oligarchy, which profits from doing business in a completely deregulated environment. In 2014, in his first official visit to Belgrade, the then Commissioner Johannes Hahn made a rather blunt statement. There is clearly an added value for Serbia, I quote, for Serbian people to become member of the EU in order to improve the welfare level, to have simply more money in your pocket. Whether this is probable or not, it is questionable. But the Commissioner's direct reference to money, instead of the usual generalities about democracy, stability, and development, can be understood only as an effort to bring tangible arguments against the renewed economic and geopolitical ties of Serbia with Russia. The European Union is by far the most important economic and trade partner of Serbia, he reminded. There is no doubt that strategic priorities are dictating more and more the EU enlargement agenda. And when this is the case, democratic and human rights scores are not the most relevant. According to surveys, the Western Balkan states are classified as non- or semi-consolidated democracies. The 2020 Freedom House Index defines all the Western Balkan states as transitional or hybrid regimes. 30 years after the end of communism, the idea of a transition to democracy is still used as pertinent, although Western democracy itself has suffered many blows in the meantime. In the same line, EU officials and other international mission staff often qualify the Balkan countries as young or immature states or democracies. As such, they require both tutoring and comprehension. Unofficially, countries are even compared to children or teenagers whose unruly behavior should be addressed with passion. This stereotype is rooted in an evolutionist perception of political systems, seen as being parallel to the stages of human lifetime. It is based on the idea of a linear progress towards political maturity, which corresponds to development with the help of time and education or experience, sponsored, of course, by the EU. Thus, the Balkan states aspiring to EU accession are repeatedly urged to do their homework. When this is not the case, the country in question is adequately called a problem child. This discourse corresponds to the perception of the Balkans not as a complete other, but as an incomplete self, as Maria Todorova has well elaborated. Balkan societies are seen as oscillating between the fundamentally different East, perceived as resistant to modernization, democracy, and rationalism, and the developed and civilized West. The observed disparities in democratization, political culture, education, and social attitudes are not contextualized socially and historically, but are taken as essential attributes of the Balkan idiosyncrasy, which the EU aims to eliminate by helping Balkan states eventually mature. Let me mention an explanation of tutoring that describes perfectly the EU policy in the Western Balkans. I quote, "A tutor provides expertise, experience, and encouragement. They do not provide answers, but rather assist in problem solving, in getting answers. The challenge is to focus on assignments within the context they are assigned. Indeed, the EU officials provide support to the future member states, bring in experts to assist in the reform of institutions and legal systems, but at the end of the day, do not intervene drastically when the system fails. Due to the above-mentioned perception of state immaturity, EU representatives adopt a condescending attitude towards domestic players in government. Despite the strict conditions and sanction mechanism foreseen, they rarely speak up in cases of violation of democratic principles or nationalist outbursts. Driven by a bon pour l'Orient approach, they lower standards and often tolerate deviations from the EU conditionality framework. The underlying assumption is that one cannot expect much in terms of democracy at this transitory stage, and that the EU leverage will be more effective in a more advanced stage of integration. They fail, however, to acknowledge that in the last 3 decades, countries of the Balkans did not only advance towards democratic consolidation, but that there were also periods of stagnation and even regression in spite of EU mentoring. Such was the case of the democratic backsliding in the Republic of North Macedonia between 2006 and 2017 under the VMRO-DPMNE majority governments led by Gruevski. Although international observers warned against the authoritarian policies and the transgressions of the rule of law, the EC progress reports were far less critical than expected, and the Commission still called for the start of accession negotiations. Officially, these were only blocked because of the name dispute with Greece. When the new Social Democratic government of North Macedonia, led by Zoran Zaev, put the country back on track, renewed the efforts to implement reforms, and signed the groundbreaking PRESPA agreement with Greece, all the obstacles seem to have been lifted. Nevertheless, in 2018, the accession process was postponed only once more due to the objection of France and the Netherlands to the enlargement procedures. Eventually, the country got the green light last March, but now Bulgaria threatens to veto the opening of accession negotiations over identity issues. Inevitably, trust in the EU is undermined by such inconsistent moves. Western Balkan nations feel that they are victims of the EU member states' power games and internal concerns due to the so-called enlargement fatigue. On the other hand, the impression that the EU is privileging regional stability over democracy resulted in strengthening the grip of political leaders who were too eager to expand their power at any means. Indeed, non-compliance to the democratic principles and the rule of law is not given full attention by the EU as long as the system seems functional and interethnic relations are under control. Professor analyzed thoroughly the relation between stabilitocracy and illiberalism earlier today. And of course, Florian Bieber has extensively elaborated on the rise of authoritarianism in the Western Balkans. Indeed, many commentators have underscored the responsibility of the international community and the EU in particular for having tolerated Gruevski's abuse of power, the silencing of opposition media, and the hijacking of public institutions. It was only when the violations of the democratic rules started threatening the stability of the country that the EU officials began to speak up. In 2013, at the midst of the political crisis in North Macedonia, the EC Enlargement Strategy report still kept an equal distance and avoided to blame the government for having forcibly evicted the opposition MPs from parliament in December 2012. Let me quote a few lines. The political crisis which followed events in parliament late last year exposed deep divisions among political parties, affecting the functioning of parliament, and demonstrated the need for constructive politics in the national interest. The consensus on the report of the Committee of Inquiry showed that constructive solutions can be found with political will, through dialogue and compromise. Overall, the country continues to sufficiently meet the political criteria. End of quote. It was only in 2016 that the EC Progress Report wrote in straightforward terms that democracy and rule of law have been constantly challenged, in particular due to the state capture affecting the functioning of democratic institutions and key areas of society. This assessment conflicted, however, with the positive recommendations of previous years and the lack of strong reaction of EU representatives vis-à-vis the abuses of Kurecic regime. Thus, public opinion largely ignored the concerns of the international community and the risk that the continuation of nationalist and anti-democratic policies represented for the country. In addition, the fact that EU statements and European Commission progress reports use a diplomatic and rather technical language, which is not easily understood by the public, allows governments to present the assessment as positive, even when it is not the case. For many consecutive years, PM Gruevski was congratulating his government for the positive EC progress reports, while only the experts could read criticism between the lines. As Vasco Popetreski wrote, in answer to any criticism the country had a dysfunctional parliament, that the judiciary was under the control of the government, or that the media was biased, the government responded that it had received a positive assessment from Brussels, with a seal of approval on its certificate of democracy. So in effect, the European Commission was indirectly undermining the pro-democratic forces in the country and providing an alibi to the government to continue its autocratic policies and practices. So I will skip more details about these issues that could be elaborated in writing, and let me conclude. I can also, I had also an analysis of culture as the Europeanization process. But to conclude, despite the erosion of the transformative power of EU integration, this remains the dominant paradigm, the ideological premise that keeps the enlargement running. In this official EU rhetoric, Europeanization is framed as a process of modernization and democratization, which will enhance stability, peace, and security, and will undoubtedly bring wealth and development to the new member states. This euphoric vision is reproduced by most political leaders in the Balkans and is serving as a legitimizing framework for the exercise of power, even by those who are reluctant to adopt the necessary reforms. Yet, EU discourse is still based on schematic representations of the Balkans. Most EU officials have a very superficial knowledge of local societies and ignore the historic cleavages that shape public perceptions to this day. Subsequently, they fail to propose viable long-term solutions to the political and ethnic tensions, which are just contained for as long as the dream of Europe offers a way forward. However, despite the politically correct discourse of EU representatives praising the responsibility and commitment of governments, the real picture of how the Balkans are perceived by EU leaders is summarized in the following phrase, published in The Economist a few years ago. I quote, "A stable Balkans is an asset for all, but an unstable and poor one could export crime and migrants, or even launch back into conflict." End of quote. There is no doubt that it is hard to get rid of stereotypes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Athena, for this presentation. And I would now move to our last presenter, who is Valentina Petrovic, who is a PhD researcher at the European University Institute in Florence. And she will be looking at Europeanization processes in Slovenia and Serbia, which is different than the program where it says Serbia and North Macedonia. So I guess that I will go by the PowerPoint presentation which she's sharing. Valentina, the floor is yours. We can't hear you though, so I don't know if your microphone is still turned off, Valentina. Now we hear something. Oh, but your microphone, Valentina, is still turned off.
Yes, now.
Perfect.
Now you can
Very
hear me,
good.
yeah.
Now we can hear you. And
Yes.
if you just go to presentation mode, perfect.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for this opportunity to speak in this conference. So, as you already mentioned, so the title was changed due to the fact that I have more currently material for Slovenia than North Macedonia, and also due to the fact that the things that I am currently researching now for my PhD thesis quite intrigued me, and I wanted to share these current findings that I have with you. So the title is Europeanization in Slovenia and Serbia, the role of unfavorable structures. As I mentioned, the presentation is based basically on 2 chapters, which are part of my PhD thesis. In my thesis, I look at the democratization process in post-Yugoslav states since its dissolution until today within a structuralist framework. So I am particularly interested in class alliances and state-society relations. And basically, the EU integration process is seen as an external variable and which is integrated in my structuralist framework. So the question for today's presentation is, what are possible unintended effects induced through the EU integration process, and how does the EU integration process interact with favorable versus unfavorable structures? And I will also shortly define what I mean when I use these terms, favorable and unfavorable structures. So in a nutshell, in both cases, there are unintended consequences from the EU integration process. Of course, due to different domestic structures, the results differ. In Slovenia, I will show that mainly today's problems in the Slovene case are linked to the weakening of civil society, mainly the weakening of labor and the working class and trade unions, while in Serbia, or in cases which have experienced war and difficult transition period, the main challenge, of course, lies in dismantling the nexus between the ruling party and their control of the institutions in the society. So, why do I believe this topic is important for us to discuss? Well, in times of crisis, the right-wing political parties is partially enabled through these unintended consequences, so their rise. And as we all witness today, these right-wing leaders are very well connected in the region, and they pose, I believe, a threat to the stability in the region. So just shortly, where do I situate myself in the literature? Of course, on the one hand, I talk to the legacies and democratization literature on Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, but also to the Europeanization literature, and more specifically to the turn in the Europeanization literature. Yesterday, we heard a short presentation on the domestic incentives model by Sedlmeier and Schimmelpfennig. Those authors have by now acknowledged that the perspective of EU accession has become less credible, and that the domestic adoption costs have risen for the Western Balkans. And also other authors have made the statement that Europeanization can have unintended negative effects on the domestic structure of the states. EU policies and institutions not only empower liberal reform coalitions to the extent that they exist in the first place, but they can also bolster the power of incumbent authoritarian and corrupt elites. So in my thesis, I basically do structured paired comparisons with 4 case studies. I did more than 60 expert interviews in Ljubljana, Skopje, Zagreb, and Belgrade. And right now I'm thinking of whether I should conduct a QCA analysis or a regression analysis with panel data. Of course, it depends on data availability and on these kind of problems. So in a nutshell, my argument is basically that for successful democratization, we need, on the one hand, cross-class coalitions with universalistic demands linked to redistributive parties that are able to win national elections. When I say universalistic demands, I mean demands that tackle the common good, demands that are not exclusive. Typically, demands by the lower classes fall into this category. And we also need autonomous state institutions. So we need institutions that do not serve particular interests, that are not captured, and that are actually able to implement impartially the rule of law, also in local, on the local level, not only on the national, but also on the local level. And the EU integration process basically interacts with this domestic dimension. Of course, the other case, in non-democratized countries, we have cross-class coalitions which are linked to particularistic demands, linked to nationalist parties, and we have non-autonomous state institutions. So when I say favorable structures, clearly you know that Slovenia has had the highest modernization levels within ex-Yugoslavia. It is ethnic homogeneous, which is also favorable for democratization to occur. But moreover, I argue in my thesis that it has had a very favorable position within the global value chain. So I believe that their high share of technologically intensive sectors and exports led to the presence of strong labor due to the industry's need for skilled labor force in their economy. So below I inserted a graph where I show the different share of technologically intensive sectors in 4 post-Yugoslav states. And this, of course, manifests itself in cooperatism in Slovenia, and which inter alia led to one of the most egalitarian and inclusive societies in the country. On the other hand, of course, Serbia has had average modernization levels at the end of the 1980s. It was ethnically heterogeneous, and it had a less favorable industrial position within the global value chain, if we take this graph as one of the indicators. So in both cases, I argue that there are unintended negative effects of Europeanization. In Slovenia, basically, it weakened the favorable structures that sustained and underpinned the political alliance from 1990 until 2004. Now, if you know Slovenia, in 2004, it coincided with the rightist turn and Janez Janša coming to power. And these tendencies were very much accelerated with the global financial crisis. In Serbia, on the other hand, being in a less favorable structural context, the focus on EU conditionality by the EU enabled the elite to comply formally with the EU integration process, while in practice it did not implement them as envisioned by the EU, or misuse them even to for state capture and for control of institutions. Just as a comparison for labor strength in the region, we can see that trade union density is falling in all 4 countries. So the steep fall, for example, in Macedonia, is due to the lack of data and due to interpolation that I did with the data. So it does not look like this in reality, but the trend is definitely downwards. If we look at other indicators, and if we particularly focus on the collective bargaining coverage in percentage, we see that Slovenian labor is very well protected in the country. It has a relatively low number of fragmentation, and it has relatively a high union density in comparison. So when I say cross-class coalition in Slovenia, I of course mean the relative majority within all 3 classes that voted for a center-left or a redistributive party, as I initially said in the theory. In this case, it is the LDS, which was dominant until Slovenia's EU accession process. Now, if you have questions for the coding or for the ESS survey, we can discuss this afterwards. Unfortunately, there is no data available for Serbia. There is only one round for Serbia but not in this time period, unfortunately. So what happened in Slovenia after 2004? So the argument is that civil society organizations actually became weakened through financialization, the inflow of foreign direct investments, and an increase in small and medium enterprises, and also a comparatively less important role of the traditional big Slovene companies. This put pressure on the institutions of the social dialogue. So what we can see in the tables, we see a growth of GDP, a budget deficit share. We see the net external debt as a share of GDP, which was of course accelerated with the global financial crisis. When looking at the Slovenian bargaining level, so if we use this as an indicator for labor strength, we definitely see a deterioration. So coming from an going from an intermediate level, where we have a dominance of central and industry level bargaining, we basically are today at the sector and industry level. Today we have Janez Janša once again as a prime minister in 2020, but this time he faces partly weakened civil society organizations. And what we are witnessing today in the region, not only in Slovenia, but specifically in the post-socialist region, we are witnessing corruption scandals. We are witnessing Janez Janša, who tries to control the Slovenian public television. And what basically secures Slovenia during this last couple of months was basically its non-captured state institutions who checked and balanced Janez Janša. In Serbia, on the other hand, the most difficult challenge has been breaking the close symbiosis between the state and organized crime, which had its roots in the 1990s. And as in Croatia, the road to Brussels led through The Hague. In light of the EU integration process, Serbia had to establish several regulatory bodies that would serve as checks and balances. Inter alia, these were the Office of the Ombudsman, the Development Fund, the Agency for Privatization, the Institution of Social Dialogue, or the Anti-Corruption Agency. But there are basically two problems related with these institutions. A, these institutions did not receive enough powers in order to investigate or check other governmental institutions or top-level politicians. And B, they did not possess any sanction mechanisms in case unlawful practice was detected. So right now, the ruling party basically either captured parts of these institutions or did not sufficiently empower them in order that these institutions do their work, right? So the argument is basically that EU pressure is not effective, but what is more, its demands have been misused in Serbia and also in other countries with unfavorable structural conditions by the political and economic elite in order to maintain and enlarge its patronage network. So coming back to the initially asked questions, what are possible unintended effects induced through the EU integration process? So paradoxically, the EU integration has weakened the very pillars of Slovenia's democratic success, weakening the favorable Slovenian structures. In Serbia, institutions that were set up in light of the EU integration process became hijacked by the ruling parties. And this was, of course, enabled through the presence of unfavorable structures. Now Janša is again in power, this time confronts partially weakened structures. Vučić in Serbia controls major institutions in the countries, and as we know, elections are not fair. And why should we care? Because those right-wing leaders are very well connected. They have a vast network in the region. And I believe that research on the consequences on EU integration should definitely point to these kind of mechanisms that are often not researched or are often not enough mentioned, that we are not aware of. Yeah, and I think I should end here my presentation. I run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect on time. thanks to all of the panelists. So we've had, I think, some very exciting, interesting papers here. We have approximately 15 minutes for questions. I've also written on YouTube, because there is a chat option on YouTube, so the people watching on YouTube are able to write their questions there if they want to, and I will be able to ask them to the participants. But I would just start out and maybe throw in a few questions for all of the panelists pick up on, and you can also ask each other questions. And I'm just going to go in the order of the presentations. For Nikoleta, my question would be, was it actually a curse to be a frontrunner in case of Montenegro? This is what it would sound like a little bit. What you're presented is the problems of what you mentioned, both being maybe viewed less critically, at least initially, by the European Union, as well as also the government could sell itself as a frontrunner, and that the frontrunner is actually, you don't want to be a frontrunner if you actually want to get things done, because you might be looked at more critically. So that's kind of my question for you. For Adam, my question would be about this. You mentioned this question of independence and insularity. And it strikes me a lot as that these reforms often don't tackle the issue of informality, the third eye missing, namely that how can you have secure independence or insularity if in fact people are very much embedded in society and informal mechanisms of control are quite strong. So, for example, the ability to control employment of spouses, offer or don't offer employment, and other ways. You could still call a judge. They might officially be able to ignore your request, but if an executive power holder does call a judge, you might be not so eager to ignore it. So that's a question about the kind of how these reforms can actually tackle that framework, and that's maybe the socialization element. But I would be curious to hear more about that. Then I think we had Petar's observation. To which degree would you see is also, I mean, what's been often commented on Croatia's EU presidency is Croatia's policy in the region, which is own kind of national policy, especially also then the ruling party's policy towards Bosnia-Herzegovina, standing in the way of Croatia's EU policy, which is, promoting enlargement, but then again, it has a kind of a specific, more narrow agenda, especially in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and how much is that attention which became visible during the presidency. Then for Athena, my question would be on the basically, I mean, I think you pointed out well the issue of the EU's also the kind of Balkanist discourse. The question is really, you've looked at the case of North Macedonia, but can the term Europeanization be salvaged from this in a certain way? Because, or is it a term we should abandon because it inherently has this? I mean, it's the problem that this process is unidirectional, right? It's not a dialogue. I mean, there are no accession negotiations. It's a process. So is this process to be salvaged, or the term to be salvaged? And then for Nikoleta, I was just wondering to which degree the trends which you've mentioned, two things. The one is the element of can you really determine parties' redistributive policies or not? For Valentina, yeah. So is this really something? For Valentina, so are there really redistributive parties or not redistributive parties in the Balkans? I mean, beyond in substance, because my impression is that the parties might be positioning themselves to be center-left or center-right, but that none of them are redistributive, or that at least there's no difference between the right and the left on the practical policies. And that also, I think the last question I think is an interesting one, is under which circumstances these right-wing authoritarian populist parties like Janša's SDS and Vučić's SNS become hegemonic, because I think one thing maybe you didn't mention is that Janša is also, you mentioned he's able to resist because he's able to not be successful because he has the resistance of independent institutions. But I think also one key difference is that his power is not absolute. I mean, in a sense, his electoral support is around 30%, so he doesn't have this kind of dominance. But then this brought me to the realization that, of course, when Vucic and his party was first elected in 2012, the party actually also only had a quarter of the vote and was a coalition partner. So in a certain way, what is the trajectory in Slovenia on that regard? These are just a few questions. So maybe, Nikoleta, do you want to kick us off? And if you want to throw in a question, so maybe we do it like that. If you want to, in answering, throw in a question to any other panelist, please do so. So Nikoleta, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your comments and for all your questions. Yes, it is true. In my presentation, I just wanted to emphasize that that we have the fact in Montenegro that for many years Montenegro has been seen as a regional leader in terms of the results achieved in the process. This was stated also in the country. It was abused from the government, but also it was stated from the EU leaders and in some previous reports. So I think that EU was not critical enough that we have results now. And I actually wanted to emphasize also the fact that what is very important now, the changes in rhetoric of the two last year reports when it comes to assessing the situation in Montenegro. So in this year progress report and the last year progress report. So we became in some way from the leader to the country, or from the regional leader of the integration to the country with a big stagnation. So I think that these changes regarding EU rhetoric in progress reports are very important, because I believe that these changes will prevent with the presentation of apparent reforms and questionable results in the future time when we talk about the results presented by the government. So it was the point, and I think that a few years ago, when some NGOs and civil society organizations, me also in Montenegro, emphasized that this rhetoric of the EU from the previous reports are very, how to say, could be very abused from the government. It was really the fact that we had some time in Montenegro. So it is very good to these changes in rhetoric, especially in terms that it will prevent the presentation of the apparent reforms and questionable results in the future period.
Great, thanks a lot. You have no questions for the other panelists, just asking, giving you a chance?
Well, not at this time, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Adam, I would give you the floor next.
Thanks, Florian. Yeah, this is a really, really good question about the third eye and informality. And I think very early on in its progress reports and its commentary on judicial reform, the EU was absolutely clear that the problem was informality. That that these informal networks with malign intent that could break down even the new walls. And actually, it was completely wrong. And I think it's really interesting, because I think, there's a tendency in some branches of the literature to say, this is the one policy area or one set of institutions where, formal rules are absolutely critical and you can't have any informality. And therefore, those sort of relationships, it's just not permissible. I think that's, we argue that's completely wrong, because actually it's the type of informality. And actually, there isn't a judicial system in the world, that you could imagine where some kind of level of informality is permissible and happens, and that there are, not everything can be, it's professional jurisdiction, and judges have to be able to exercise that jurisdiction in ways that involve them kind of, having conversation, whatever. So I think, yes, informality is a problem. But it's more of the question of saying, well, actually, it's the wrong kind of informality. If it's the informality that is about, a sort of, favours and all those sorts of things. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the correct rule, one of the problems has been that the EU's obsession with limiting that and preventing that, and actually over prescriptive set of rules and trainings that actually does not say, okay, you know, these are high level professionals, and I think I'm making that point. I just would add one question to sort of a couple of the papers. I mean, I thought they're absolutely fascinating, but I feel compelled to say, I mean, look, you know, who can be enthusiastic about the transformative power of Europe? Who can be, you know, I think we all have to sort of, we're staring that one in the face. But there are, I think that now the threat is that we're not doing what we perhaps did in the past. We've got to be mindful of not saying, well, okay, this is because this has happened, or this situation happened because of enlargement and Europeanization. And you may say, Florian, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's really important, particularly when we're looking at, you know, poverty and distribution. I mean, that's not to let the EU off the hook, but it's rather to say that actually the EU was the transformative power, or was more of a kind of transitional power. The EU was the conduit for a set of reforms and institutionalizing a set of reforms that really were part of the sort of global integration of this region, for better or for worse. So I just sort of feel a little bit, we've got to be a little bit mindful of that. But you know, I'm sure that's, you know, that's understood and taken. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Adam. Petar, you would be next in line.
Okay, the discrepancy between the ruling parties' policy towards Bosnia-Herzegovina and prevention of European policy. I mean, the situation is mostly known. We have the ruling party, which is center-right. It was more nationalistic in some previous periods under Tudjman and Karamarko. It has been ruling for 22 out of 30 years since we have a multi-party system. It has a dominant influence over society in connections with the church, judiciary, public funds. We have had numerous corruption scandals. Some of them are just recent, and but still it hasn't lost much of its support. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the situation is, of course, a bit complex. They have the ruling party in Croatia has their basin of votes, which gives them 3 MPs, which of course can be decisive as it is now, because the government is literally hanging on one vote. They always have a reserve of a couple of MPs which change sides. The previous government had about 10 MPs which supported the ruling the government, although they were elected on the other in the name of the opposition. But still, the government basically hangs on one MP now. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, they have like I said, basin of votes in general and presidential elections, which can be decisive. The problem is, of course, there are legitimate reasons for not supporting the current situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is mostly expressed through the fact that the Bosnian population actually elects 2 members of the state's presidency. And they claim that the Croats do not have a legitimate representative in the person of Mr. Komšić, which is true, but also it is legal. This situation, this current situation, is legalistic, but it's not legitimate, and there are many grievances. There are also calls that Croats should have their own entity, as the Serbs have, and these are still very silent, not so much, not official. And also it is interesting that a sort of a consensus exists between the prime minister and the ruling party and the state's current president, who was elected on the clear opposition towards the ruling party, the former prime minister, which led only two of the governments that were not governed by the HDZ, the ruling party. But when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, a state interest, a national interest and consensus exists that the current situation is simply not something that could last forever, and that the significant changes are needed. We can say also that in Bosnia now the Serbian representatives and Croatian are cooperating and speaking between each other, and the Bosnian representatives are sort of put aside out of these talks. So I will stop here. But yeah, in a sense, Croatia has this historical connections, maybe sort of a historical burden as Serbia has towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it can of course be a ballast that prevents a totally European. Of course, yeah.
Great, thanks, Petar. Athena, you're next.
So coming back to terms, my point is that Europeanization reproduces the idea that the Balkans and Eastern Europe are not genuinely European. And that has its own consequences on the way they are viewed and the way they are politically administered. Traded. So imagine when we had the integration of Spain or Portugal to the European Union. Did we ever spoke of Europeanization of Spain or Portugal, or even of I don't know, even of Cyprus? I don't think they even use this word for Cyprus. So it's only for the Balkans and Eastern Europe. It's the idea that they are at the margins. They are not exactly European. Slavs are not exactly Europeans. They are something. We are even a little bit afraid of them, and they are wild. They are fun, but they are wild. And okay, I'm stopping here with stereotypes. So I think that analytically it has a problem, and it creates consequences. Now let me say something from my experience when I was a member of the OSCE mission to Skopje. And what struck me when I was discussing with many people in the mission, but also from the other international organizations, the EU, etc., was that they were expecting different things from a Macedonian or Balkan government than if they were talking of their own country. Like when there were questions of limiting freedoms and breaching rights and rules and democratic rules, they were somehow thinking that this was expected from the Balkans, and they were not ready to address it straightforwardly. So even when there was this the construction of Skopje 2014, which was obviously something that had to do with not only nationalism but also the representation of Europe, authoritarian ways of implementing decisions for the city, and blah blah blah. They wouldn't react as they would if it was this was happening in their own countries, but only saying, okay, we cannot criticize them because it is speech. So there are different criteria for the Balkans, and I think that this is one of the shortcomings of the EU approach.
Thanks a lot. Last but not least, Valentina, if you could just give us our thoughts briefly. We're running a bit over time.
Okay, briefly. So the first question, are there any redistributive parties or not? So the terminology was just used because of the theory that I used from Heller. So there are only redistributive parties, of course, in Slovenia during the 1990s. They do not on the policy dimension, on the economic dimension, they do not differ after 2000. I mean, the same problem in old democracies. But I believe that there are cultural differences among the parties. So maybe the term non-nationalist or non-right-wing populist parties would be more suitable for the region. And for the second question, what is the trajectory for Slovenia? Well, basically, I think Slovenia is really in a critical juncture right now, because maybe Janša was not successful in controlling the state television in Slovenia, because he was stopped by the court. He already changed personnel in the security apparatus, and he learns from other right-wing populist leaders. So he is using now his own media outlets that he created with the help of Orban circles, and he also uses daily Twitter. So for me personally, I think Slovenia is now at a critical junction, and I don't know if its democracy will survive entirely intact as strong as it was 20 years ago.
Thanks for the sobering thought. And I want to conclude maybe also with Adam's appeal that, of course, for all the weaknesses of democracy and otherwise, we shouldn't always blame the European Union. Of course, there are other mechanisms at play.
Absolutely.
But of course, it's hard to be optimistic about the processes we've been looking at through the different country studies. So thanks all for giving your papers. Very interesting food for thought. And for the listeners, we have a break in 15 minutes. The last panel will be of the conference, and two of us at least will be on that panel. So hope to see you all there. Thanks and goodbye.
Thanks, folks. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.